Welcome to Folding Ideas. I'm your host, the Foldable Human. We've talked before about how failure fits into video games as games, but right now I want to take that idea and step even further back, looking at games as a medium and art form. There are those in the collective culture who claim that video games are not and cannot ever be art. They're wrong, of course, but why are they wrong? There's a lot of reasons, but the one that I want to focus on right now is this concept here, that by giving control to the audience you undermine the narrative integrity of the artwork. When you sit down to watch a film, everyone in the theater is shown the same thing. A book contains the same words and a painting is the same brushstrokes. Games, on the other hand, allow for vastly differing physical experiences. The first time I played Ico, it took me a little over 14 hours. The second time it took me only 2. My sister started, but she never finished. On the surface, this seems like a valid observation then. Movies don't allow you to spend 30 minutes wandering around shooting blue portals at every surface trying to figure out where to go. I mean, could you imagine Chinatown with an extra half hour of Geddes getting lost trying to find an address? The pace of the film would be destroyed and the ultimate meaning and impact would be diluted. It would cease to be the perfect movie and would become that movie where the main character gets lost for half the runtime. So, pacing and structure are certainly important elements of narrative. That much is true. Or is it? Okay, I agree that it's an incredibly important element, but I'm going to suggest that it's not a universal element. Different media and genres place different demands on pacing, structure, and flow. For a moment, we're going to have to go back to one of my favorite subjects, language. Language is more than just what you find in a dictionary. It's the all-encompassing mechanics of communication. You can communicate an idea with words, for sure, but you can also use facial expressions, body language, color, light, contrast, and hundreds of other techniques that form the backbone of dozens of genres and mediums. If there's communication, the transmission of ideas, then there's language. If the audience doesn't understand the language, then there's a failure of communication. So this idea that games are weaker because the audience can fail isn't actually unique to games, because books, painting, photography, television, and movies can all fail to communicate in their own ways. Let's get the most obvious out of the way, spoken or written language. If you don't speak the regional language a film or book is written in, then you probably won't understand it. Oh, sure, you might get the gist of it, for film at least, where the overall language is so much more than just the spoken dialogue. But if you don't speak 17th century Spanish, then you're probably not going to get very far into El Ignacio Hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha before you give up. But this extends even deeper than capital L languages. There's a massive online trend of niche and genre film, book, and television reviewers who are proving that the inherent language of film isn't as inherent as it seems. What makes a great art film isn't the same as what makes a great action film. The language of schlocky horror isn't the same as the language of cheesy comedy. The pacing, gags, blocking, lighting, music, and mimetic shorthand are all different. If you can't adjust to the recursive and broadly referencing language of something like adaptation, then the movie is going to be an unwatchable mess. If you don't understand solipsism, then the gnawing uncertainty and madness that builds throughout Broken Flowers won't even register, and the entire film will just look like Bill Murray being sort of funny in a really, really awkward way. As a musical example, if you've never dealt with crushing depression, then the Bare Naked Ladies' Pinch Me is just a catchy tune with some odd lyrics.
I feel fine enough, I guess, considering everything's a mess.
This capacity for miscommunication is probably the most dramatic in the still mediums. A viewer can stare at a painting or photograph for seconds, minutes, or hours, completing the mechanical observation, and yet still never understand what it was they were looking at or why it was interesting. This is most obvious in social or political art, as these pieces typically require extensive explanation in order to get a modern viewer up to speed with the language of the piece. Maybe what makes it interesting isn't all that obvious to start. It's like Andy Warhol's art. It's been around so long at this point that you have to take a step back to remember a time when it was special, and people really weren't too sure what to do with it. So, yeah, context is a factor too. All of this is language that goes into the communication of the ideas and intents, and without that shared language, the viewer can fail. They may stay in the theater until the credits roll, they may stay awake until the end, but they've still sat and spun their mental tires for a bit, making no progress towards the actual conclusion. Failure is no more unique to video games than color is to painting. In addition to that, the possibility of vastly different physical experiences isn't unique either. Looking at my Ico example from earlier, I was able to finish the game 2 different times. 14 hours the first time, 2 hours the second. My sister never finished. Compared to film, this seems obscene. Chinatown, 30 minutes of driving around, pacing, all that we talked about earlier. That'd be a pretty damning point if film was the only narrative media out there. But what about books? We still consider pacing to be important in literature, even though the time it takes to read a book can be pretty extreme from person to person. It took me almost 10 months to work my way through Les Mis. The first time I read The Giver, it took me a couple of weeks, reading it a half hour or more at a time. The fourth or fifth time I read it, it took me maybe 4 hours cover to cover. But we still talk about books as being well or poorly paced, even if it takes one person hours longer to get through 50 pages than it takes someone else. Okay, so if there's all these similarities between video games and film and literature and photography and painting and music, then why is there any controversy at all? Well, because there are differences, but in my mind, this is where we start to get into the really cool stuff. Video games bring in new vectors for interaction and communication, basically new forms of language that merge the capabilities of other mediums. In video games, the mechanics of playing the game are as much a part of the language as the dialogue, music, art, and pacing. One of the best examples of this is the first-person shooter. Now, at first glance, it may seem that the first-person games would be the easiest for new players to pick up, but they're actually one of the hardest. First-person games rely on very specific conventions in their control scheme, a vocabulary of commands, if you will, using one hand to steer the feet while using the other to steer the head and torso. That kind of spatial abstraction is surprisingly difficult for new players to master, while incredibly intuitive for people who already know it. Like a language? This language element becomes incredibly obvious if you go back and play the early versions of complicated genres like real-time strategy games. Games like Warcraft, Orcs and Humans, or Dune 2 lack many of the control options that we've become used to, and trying to play them these days is like trying to explain Insanity Wolf to your grandparents. It's a communication problem. Beyond that, the natural extension of mechanics are the choices they represent and the consequences of those choices. This folds back into the whole discussion of failure. The ability to fail is intrinsic to communication, and more than other media, games allow us to explore that failure in novel ways. How do we respond to challenges, incentives, and options? How do we solve problems? So let's go back to that original question. Some people say video games aren't art. They're wrong. Why are they wrong? Well, because the entire basis of their argument is wrong. They're framing it as a one or the other argument, which just isn't the case. Literature isn't going anywhere, neither is motion picture, music, or graphic art. Interactive art complements and in many ways borrows from and uses these other mediums, the same as they trade back and forth between each other. Interactive art also opens up avenues of exploration and questioning that other media just can't do as well. The funny thing is that these opponents of video games seem to know this already. Interactive exhibits have been commonplace in fine art galleries for decades and were hardly unheard of prior to that. Exhibits that allowed participants to throw paint at a wall, write their name, break plates, or reposition performers. If that's art, then why not Ico? Elitism and ignorance, plain and simple. They're old people who don't share the language and see the target market as full of undesirables. For a complex issue, it at least has a really simple answer.